Do you wonder how all the G.I. Joe stories fit together? Well then, G.I. Joe Basic Training is for you. During the past 26 years, there have been many stories told in various formats in the G.I. Joe A Real American Hero universe. Some are major stories, and some are side stories from those main stories. Unlike some brands, G.I. Joe has been able to maintain a sort of consistent, regular story, even though there has been attempts at rebooting the brand several times. I will now outline these major and sub-stories. There have been 9 major stories or continuities, 3 connected stories or continued continuities, and many sub-stories or those stories that are not connected to the main continuity at that time. I will not be including the original 12-inch toy line beginning in 1964, even though there have been attempts to connect it to A Real American Hero. Nor will I be including those various stories that took place outside the United States. Those will be saved for a future video. In 1982, Hasbro released the toy line G.I. Joe A Real American Hero. To promote this toy line, a comic book and an animated series was released. These followed separate story paths and are our first 2 major stories. The comic book was written by Larry Hama and was published by Marvel Comics. The book ended with issue 155 in 1994 when the G.I. Joe team was decommissioned. This run was one long continuous story with a second, brief, comic series adding to the main story, also written by Hama, called Special Missions. Another series, G.I. Joe and the Transformers, was also connected into this main storyline. Later, near the end of the Marvel series, Transformers Generation 2 was introduced into the main story, and their title, Transformers Generation 2, became a sort of spin-off from G.I. Joe. Next, we have the animated series. It told a story that was separate from the comic book and was aimed more at kids, unlike the gritty, realistic comic book. The animated series aired for 4 years and ended with the animated movie in 1987. It was brought back in 1989 by another company, but that animated series ended after its second year. Now, it could be argued that the file cards that came with the toys are a major story, all of their own or connected to the comic book, because Larry Hama, the writer of the comic book, also wrote most of the file cards. So I will leave that up to you to decide how the comic books and the file cards fit together. During that time, there was another comic book published by Blackthorn Publishing called G.I. Joe in 3D. This was a short-lived series and not connected to the Marvel Comics series or written by Larry Hama, and thus is a sub-story of A Real American Hero. 1995 was a troubled year for G.I. Joe. The A Real American Hero line had just been discontinued, and a new line was begun with Sergeant Savage and the Screaming Eagles. This story, as shown in a single animated episode, was a direct continuation to A Real American Hero. Later in 1995, when the Sergeant Savage toy line was also discontinued, a brand new reboot of the G.I. Joe brand was released called G.I. Joe Xtreme. This was also short-lived. The animated show lasted only 2 seasons, and the comic book lasted only 8 issues. G.I. Joe Xtreme took place in the future. Even though Sergeant Savage was used in this version of Joe, one issue of the comic mentioned that Project G.I. was founded in 1990, so this Joe was definitely a reboot with no connection to A Real American Hero. G.I. Joe disappeared for a few years and came roaring back in the early 2000s. A new company called Devil's Due Publishing had picked up the license for a new comic series. This series picked up where Hama's Marvel series left off and continued the major comic book story from years before. Devil's Due also toyed with creating stories that were separate from their main story. The series G.I. Joe Reloaded reinvented the Joe team like Marvel did with the Ultimate line. Another company, Dreamwave Productions, released a sub-story not connected to the main series and had G.I. Joe and the Transformers meet during the World War II era. During this time, the action figure line returned to the A Real American Hero characters, but with a modern update. Not enough to be a full reboot, but enough to be considered a new major story. Some fans refer to this era as Generation 2, not an official title. I refer to this as the G.I. Joe vs. Cobra Trilogy. This was a connected story between the vs. Cobra, Spy Troops, and Valor vs. Venom toy lines, and saw 2 animated movies released, once again not connected to the comic books. In 2005, Hasbro once again did a reboot of the line with Sigma 6. It was a more technologically advanced story. The animated series made brief mention of the events that took place in the Valor vs. Venom movie, and so could be considered a continuation. However, the animated series quickly went in its own direction and did not mention previous events again. Devil's Due also released a comic book miniseries, but it did not last long enough to know if it was a separate story. At this point, all parts of Sigma 6 should just be considered one story. Devil's Due would lose the comic book license to IDW in 2008. IDW did not continue the Devil's Due story, but instead created their own new major story. IDW did hire Larry Hama to continue the story he had written for Marvel Comics, and this caused a problem. Now, there were 2 stories that continued the original Marvel comic book. This one ended up being the official continuation for a few reasons. 1. Larry Hama, the original writer-creator of G.I. Joe, was continuing his story. 2. IDW continued the issue numbering from the last Marvel comic. And 3. IDW declared that this was the official continuation. This caused all of the Devil's Due stories to get thrown off to the side as they no longer officially happened. Soon the Devil's Due stories would be considered as an alternate universe and thus be considered a new separate major story. All the miniseries that IDW releases are all set in their own separate sub-stories, such as Infestation, Future Noir, and Danger Girl G.I. Joe. The next year, 2009, 2 new major stories would be released. The first one was called Resolute. It was an adult-oriented animation that was released online in 10 5-minute segments. It was more like the original comic book, but with a grittier and more realistic tone. The second was the movie universe began by The Rise of Cobra and continued 4 years later with Retaliation. IDW released multiple movie-related comics, and Hasbro aired an online animated miniseries the year after The Rise of Cobra. Also taking place after The Rise of Cobra, but before Retaliation, G.I. Joe Renegades was released, which was an animated series that again presented a new major story where the G.I. Joe team were fugitives seeking to clear their name. It ran for a year before being canceled. It was not related to the movie universe. I hope this has been helpful and you can now see how some of these stories are connected or not connected, or how they were connected but are no longer connected. G.I. Joe is filled with a rich history and a lot of great stories. Just because some stories have come and gone does not make them any less important. They are all part of the overall G.I. Joe experience, and that is what we all are really here for, the G.I. Joe experience. Thank you for stopping by and watching the first episode of G.I. Joe Basic Training, a new series that will dive deep into all aspects of the G.I. Joe universe. If you want to drop me a line, please do so in the comment section below. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to be notified when future videos come out, hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon next to it. Again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week on the next episode of G.I. Joe Basic Training.